Perfect. Okay. So I'm just going to screen share for folks so you'll be able to see my slides over the course of our conversation here. Please do interrupt, ask questions. Happy to get into really anything folks are interested in talking about related to media, building better media habits. Obviously, this is our second session of a planned year-long program between myself and the library. For those of you who were not at the first session or need a quick refresher, I'm Dr. Cory Barker. I'm an assistant professor of communication at Bradley here in Peoria. And I teach journalism and digital media to students at Bradley. I've taught a few courses in the OSHA lifelong learning program here in the area as well. So I'm really interested in conversations about media literacy and media habits. So thank you for coming out, and I really appreciate it. And I'm happy to, as I said, answer any questions as we go through. So please do not hesitate to interrupt. We've got the chat function that you can also use on your Zoom tool. If you're familiar with Zoom, you should be able to drop a question or an answer into the chat as we go over things this evening, and we'll just get into it. So a few folks joined us the first time around, and we talked a little bit about obviously developing better media habits. And that means not only thinking about how to be a better news consumer, which we're going to focus a little bit more on tonight, but just a more broader consideration of, a better media habits related to, how often you're using your devices, where you're watching your news or reading your news or listening to your news, what other forms of media entertainment you're consuming on a regular basis, thinking about patterns and habits and routines. And part of the first session was we took a moment and thought about some of the habits that we would potentially maybe want to change in 2022. Didn't want to put too much New Year's resolution energy on it, but we were just thinking a little bit about, it's a new year. We might have a media habit or two that we would like to change in one form or another. Is there anybody in the audience who actually attended our first session and would like to share what their habit was that they might have wanted to change? Was there anybody here the first time around? Well, I'll say, just to maybe tee up the conversation this time, if as you're thinking about this, the thing that I discussed in that session was a habit related to phone usage, and not specifically a certain amount of time, but really not being so connected to my phone from the moment that I wake up every morning. Obviously using it as an alarm clock makes that a little bit harder. But I have been trying to not, carry my phone around with me in the morning, and try to ease into the day without checking email from students and coworkers or things like that, or reading the news or looking at social media so quickly in the morning. And I would say that I've had a pretty good success rate with that thus far. I think I've only had a couple of mornings since our first session where I actually took my phone out of the bedroom before 7 or 8 a.m. when I usually am getting up at 5:30 or so. So that's been something that's really useful. Does anyone here tonight have a media habit that they would potentially like to work on and improve over the next couple of months or the year? And again, you can share that with your audio, or you can just put that in the chat. Well, now I'm seeing them. Great. Sorry, I was missing some of the chat. It was off the side of my screen. I'm glad I'm now seeing it. I apologize. Okay, so mentioning also not looking at the phone first thing, not have the laptop open while doing other things like watch it. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think we talked about this in the first session. I see Bob, Bob asking about the first session. We didn't record that one. We're going to record all of them from here on out, just for the record. So even if when we hopefully have these in person moving forward, we will simulcast on Zoom and also record and post them online. The conversation that we had that first time was really thinking about like how the pandemic has especially accelerated a lot of these habits, right? Because most people have spent more time at home on devices than they probably did even, as late as 2019, right? So thinking about how our habits have maybe gotten a little looser, or some might say a little worse. I try to avoid that term in this context, but I've certainly spent probably more time on my computer and on my phone in the last couple of years than I did previously. And I obviously do a lot of my job, a lot of my work as a professor on my computer. So as we go through tonight's session, maybe just, folks who are new, think about something that you have in mind, if you didn't mention it, or even maybe something related to news that you would like to potentially improve. No pressure, just have it in mind. And if you come back to a future session and you want to share maybe a way that you've tried to improve that habit, be great. So we concluded last time, and for those who missed the first one, we really just had a broad conversation about what does the media environment look like right now, right? And what we really focused on were a lot of data points, survey data showing us things that we know, but really confirming those ideas that people are spending a lot of time on their phones, on devices for hours and hours at a day. And that crosses age demographics, crosses race demographics. Obviously, there are differences between what people 14 to 18 are doing on their phones compared to people who are 54 to 58. But across the board, more mobile devices, more time, consuming media and news and information than basically ever before. And a lot of that is happening through the prism of social media, even if that means starting in social media and then making it to news, right? Like clicking on a story from Facebook or clicking on a story from social media, right? But there's also heavy still consumption of news in other sources, right? Whether that's cable television, local radio, right? But every year that percentage of how people are getting their news on a device of some sort goes up, right? So what we want to do tonight then is just talk a little bit about, and obviously we only have an hour, how do we be a little bit more news literate, right? And next time we'll talk a little bit more specifically about things like misinformation and disinformation, address how we deal with those things, especially online. But, just tonight, thinking a little bit more deeply about how do we make ourselves a little bit more news and media literate, right? So just broadly speaking, the definitions of media literacy and news literacy, there's a lot of different ways to put this, but the terms that I like to use for media literacy, just the ability to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and act using all different types of formats, media of communication. Also trying to build an understanding of the role of media in society. That's a big one, thinking more broadly and contextually about the purpose, the presence of media and news institutions in our society. And then, how can we use those tools, use that information to, create our own content, create our own media as tools of self-expression. And all of this is developed through formal and informal education, meaning, you learn a lot of this stuff in school in some form or another, but a lot of it also comes through just being a consumer, being in these environments, right? So that's media literacy. For news literacy specifically, which I want to talk a little bit more about, and I'm going to jump ahead here real quick. It's really more about our ability to evaluate news reliability, right? So can we distinguish between news and opinion? Can we distinguish between assertion and verification? Can we evaluate sources? Can we evaluate, the evidence on the basis of how authoritative they are, how independent, how accountable they are to the public, to the ideas of, truth? How do we work through ideas related to bias, both in the publication or the journalist and ourselves? and thinking more about like, how does the medium or the platform shape the message itself, right? How does it being on TV differ than if that same news is delivered in a newspaper or delivered via social media or a podcast, right? And then again, thinking more about understanding the role of news and journalists, should say, not journalists, in a democratic society. So from your vantage point out there, on a day-to-day basis, which of these bullet points do you think is most important, to you personally or to just people in general? When you're thinking about being a better news consumer, which of these things is most important? So we got one vote for evaluating sources. Other thoughts? Definitely important to think about, the differences between journalism and opinion, between traditional, hard news reporting and even soft news. But like, it's important to know when you're seeing a story that has clear opinion and perspective in that conventional way, and when you're reading a story or encountering a story that is trying at least to be down the middle reported storytelling, right? And I think obviously, and we'll get to this momentarily, when you're looking at something like a newspaper, theoretically, just the physical, tactile nature of a paper that you can turn to sections that tell you where things are, gives you a little bit more of an awareness or understanding of how different stories are being presented. And when you encounter those things, especially online, it's a little harder to make those determinations, saying nothing of the fact that the lines between like straight news and opinion have blurred at themselves, right? And to Alice's point, yeah, I think to some extent, to be able to distinguish between news and opinion and assertion and verification, like people making claims and then actually verifying those claims, requires you to better understand sources, evidence, the independence, the accountability of those things. I think one of the other challenges here is that, when we think about opinion, that often leads us down the road of something like bias. And there are, obviously well put together opinion pieces that are in conventional news sources, like the New York Times obviously has a huge opinion section. And opinion pieces are often well researched, well reported, like they're interviewing people, they're doing their own work, right? But then they obviously have a little bit more of a persuasive angle to them, right? It's a different style of writing. I think that's also one of the challenges, that when you say opinion or opinionated writing, I think people immediately go to like, well, that's biased. It's not necessarily just immediately biased. It has a clear perspective. It has a different end goal, which is to persuade you of a point as opposed to just inform you, right? But in evaluating like what is a good opinion piece, it requires us to think more deeply about sources and the evidence that is being provided to make that, effort to persuade. The piece about medium and platform, to things that people are saying in the comments, I think is so essential to our contemporary, conversation in when we are encountering pieces of information, especially in different spaces online, or comparing and contrasting like online to TV or to print, right? Obviously, the internet allows for things to be a lot more interactive, allows for really cool presentation of data and information and a mix of video and audio. And as we know, unfortunately, all those things can be manipulated or taken out of context, where websites that look really great and look really clean and have these really interesting presentations of data or video content or whatever that is, stuff that if you're in J school or you're in my classes and we point to like, this is the type of, from a production standpoint you want to make, But then if it's rife with poor sourcing or straight up mis or disinformation, that presentation, the medium or the packaging can really sway people and encourage them to not even think about sourcing or evidence and stuff like that, right? So the biggest challenge to all of these things, and we go from these first few bullet points, which are really granular when you're in the story, thinking about, is this hard news? Is this an opinion piece? Where are the sources here? What links can I click on? That's all like story by story, to the last bullet point, which is very, 20,000 foot view. What is the role of journalism in society? The speed at which people, myself included, and I'm sure a lot of us are feeling this way, consume news, and the amount of news that we are bombarded with on a daily basis, whether we're actively trying to consume it or not, complicates this immensely, right? The fact that if you do go online, or if you even turn on the television, you are really just blasted with news and information that, even if you want to do these things, it takes a lot of work to slow down, to kind of tune out the noise. Hopefully some of the things we talk about in the back half of the session will provide a little advice, but it still is, a challenge to combat that real speed, right? So one of the things that I see all the time, and people note in the chat if you've seen something like this before, is this media bias chart. This is one of these things when I go and look up for resources for how to talk about news literacy and to talk about the things that journalists can do well and how they serve society. Even in like teacher and professor like Facebook groups, like, oh, here's a great tool. This is something that gets circulated a lot. Have people seen this media bias chart or a version of this before? Anybody? We got one vote for yes. So this is, they update this quite a bit. And it's put together, you can see in the top left, by it's a sort of group of consultants and folks who have been in academia, been in industry, who have done this extensive research into trying to determine, as you can see here, what is, quote unquote, or what are the most biased news sources. And obviously it's framed or presented to us in a conventional American political ideology context, where the things on the left are thought to be, hyper partisan, most extreme towards the left, and we've got the ones on the right that are thought to be pretty extreme on that side of the political spectrum as we know it. And this gets circulated a lot. There's this huge methodology and research in how they're supposedly doing this, and you can see here on the left, fact-oriented reporting, mostly analysis, or a mix of fact reporting and analysis. And as you go to the bottom, like inaccuracies, just straight up fake information. What's interesting about this, and I think it's a useful tool, but it also underlines why focusing on something like bias or complete objectivity, which at least, they're not, going down that road too much here, can be really, really challenging, right? That even something like this that is really well meticulously put together by a group of people, not just one person, obviously, to do the analysis of like what's, mostly analysis or mostly fact or skews left or skews right, you have to like create that framework. And the people who are creating that framework obviously have their own perspective about what counts as fact-based reporting, or what counts as opinion, or what counts as analysis, or even these categories of hyperpartisan, skews, middle, all of those things. And so I wanted to show this because I do think it's a decently useful tool from time to time to look at the things that they sort of identify as, news sources that are in the middle, things like PBS, NPR, AP, right, Reuters. But it's also to underline that this is such a like kind of tricky conversation that anytime we talk about, objectivity or thinking about bias, those are all like in the eye of the beholder, right? Those are things that are always up to the determination of the person who is doing the analysis or having the conversation, or in this case, like even doing longitudinal analysis of all these companies. You still have to like make choices that are all based on your own perspective, right? That there's not an exact science to do this type of thing, which again makes it hard for us then to determine how this process works. And just to underline how they do this, we rate the news for reliability and bias to help people navigate the news landscape. What they do is look at the source, analyze the content itself to rate it. We've created a system of news content ratings that has beneficial applications for all stakeholders in a healthy news media landscape, including consumers, educators, and so on. So using political scientists, human analysis, as they say, they're trained to look at the content, which is all really interesting. But you also see here that like they're providing this for not just educators, but also publishers, marketers, things like that, right? So they're also trying to make some potential money off of this, right? Which is not inherently bad, but again, as an arbiter of what is totally objective or what is right down the middle, it's not totally unreliable, but it's also not the gospel, right? So one of the challenges, or one of the kind of categories of how do we become more news literate, right? It are the whole bucket of things that we've done, right? That we do that are a result of our habits, as we've discussed, right? Things like hyperlocalism, right? That we, as a population in the United States, there's a smaller and smaller number of people who really care to consume news in a traditional form on a regular basis. But there are more and more options to appeal to that smaller and smaller group of people. So that creates all sorts of consequences for the type of news we get, how successful news and media companies are financially, right? The further blurring of news and opinion, but also like news and advertising, news and marketing, right? But one of the challenges is just there's so many options out there, and so few people are, totally invested in reading and consuming news on a regular basis, that the pool of potential consumers to reach to be totally literate is automatically smaller than it could potentially be, because there's all these other opportunities for entertainment or information that are not, kind of traditional news sources. There's also what we would call selective exposure, right? That it's easier than ever to seek out or curate the news that confirms your perspective, right? Which I think we all get to some extent, right? That we're probably not regularly seeking out news that is from maybe a certain political ideology that we don't agree with generally. And so there's a thought that why would we, seek out that news and kind of make ourselves mad every day, right? The byproduct of, or the consequence of selective exposure is obviously something that we call the filter bubble, right? Which over time, by selectively exposing yourself to certain things and not exposing yourself to other things, you create that bubble, right? That you start to confirm your own perspective. You have the things that you believe to be true and important reinforced back to you. And then over time, it starts to create your own version of reality, right? You've filtered out people that you disagree with, news sources that you disagree with, information that you disagree with, and you potentially create a version of the reality that's not quite, the world that we live in, right? You live in a slightly different reality, or extremely different reality. Can anybody think of examples of how we see, the filter bubble idea play out in, our current world over the last couple of years? How have we seen this really rear its head in everyday life? Any thoughts? One example might be, misinformation, skepticism, disinformation, all of the buzzwords you might want to throw out related to the pandemic and vaccines, right? If you are in certain circles and you're getting a certain type of news and information about the pandemic or about vaccines, and you're tuning out other perspectives, right? You're maybe living in a world where you don't think that the vaccine is effective. You think maybe the pandemic is not as serious as it has been. Obviously, there are more extreme versions of that. It's not real, that people who have died haven't died, things like that, right? Same thing is true with the misinformation and skepticism or disbelief related to the election results, right? That if you're in Facebook groups or you're consuming certain types of news on TV, online, having politicians tell you that the election was stolen, and specifically the presidential election was stolen, right? And you're not willing to listen to alternative perspectives, despite all evidence that the election wasn't stolen, then that potentially leads you down the rabbit hole of joining Facebook groups where you end up at the Capitol January 6th of last year, right? So there are real world effects of having that kind of selective exposure that ultimately kind of puts you in a bubble, right, of news consumption where, yeah, you're getting some facts, you're getting the highlights of the day, you're hitting news values, timeliness, dealing with prominent people, you're reading or consuming stories that have an impact, but you're not getting the full picture, right? And so that has a real world consequence that I think a lot of us deal with in one form or another. I think one big piece of this when we think about how do we encounter news is, as a few people mentioned, just that idea of the medium or the format, right? And it's not even just individual stories, it's also just the presentation of the entire package, right? So on the left is just a screenshot of a PDF of the front page of the Journal Star from today, right? And obviously it's a digital copy, but let's pretend for the sake of this exercise that it's a physical copy. How do we know on a daily basis, if we look at a newspaper, which stories are most important, the ones that impact us? How does the newspaper tell us every day, these are the things that are most important? So we get literally the phrase above the fold, right? That literally, the folding of the newspaper on the newsstand in a world that newsstands, still kind of existed. So what's on the front page? What's above the fold? What has the biggest, as far as literally the font size, headlines, right? Potentially what is visible in photos, which has historically not been as important as the text, but in the case of the example we see today, right? Obviously, such a visual news story with the weather. So we get above the fold, front page, big headlines, potentially big photos, right? And then when we turn individual sections, right, we know even in the sports section, the things that matter, right? Or the the local section or the crime section or health or whatever it is in a world where, we've got a larger newspaper. When we're looking online, I just took a screenshot of, my Twitter feed randomly before our event started. I follow mostly journalists, people who work for news organizations themselves on a platform like Twitter. And when you're just looking at your feed on any social platform, right? Whether that's Twitter, whether that's Facebook, Instagram, is there a way to be able to tell what is the most important information in a given day? Like if you just see these 3 random posts that were taken from 2 journalists and then a news source that covers, Hollywood and award season, is there really any way to tell in any given moment what's most important? So potentially, if you're looking at a place like Twitter, on the side, they've got potentially trending topics, the hashtags that have floated to the top, right? That might tell you something for sure. a lot of times with even a platform like Twitter, and we'll talk about this in a later session, they kind of manipulate that in that they know people look at that, and they even just pull like tweets that have gone like sort of viral from individual non-celebrity, non-news people, and it's about some random topic. And then that gets added to the side, and then more people just add in on that conversation, which is this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy of like what's important. So there is that piece, I agree, but it's also completely like algorithmically data driven, and there's a flattening, right? So if I see a tweet from, this guy here at the top, he's a New York Times journalist, and he's just making an offhanded comment about the market. But if I see his tweet and then I see a tweet here from a verified news source, Gold Derby, there's nothing really different between those two things, right? It's not as if one is higher than the other at any given point. The feed is moving reverse chronologically. You can't really like send a bigger photo. You can't make your font bigger to say like, this is really important. You can do capitalization and like say breaking news or something like that to try to get people's attention. But even when you think about the medium or the platform, so many of these digital sources that we use kind of mess up that conventional understanding of how news is weighed, right? And how it's presented to us. And it flattens our understanding of what's actually important right now. What is really impacting people in my community, however we're defining community. And some conventional news sources obviously make that a little bit cleaner, right? Above the fold, the breaking sort of early segments on radio or television news, right? You're watching the 5 o'clock news, the first like 6 to 8 minutes, right? Those are the most important stories. And then as the half hour, the hour goes on, you're getting into slightly less important or more national stuff or something like that, right? But when you're online, everything is just kind of smashed together, right? News organization like newspaper websites have tried to replicate this, by having the most important stuff at the top, but they're so immense and so interactive that it's really easy to kind of move around those without even really paying attention to what's on the front, right? So those are some of the things that we see, on websites and social media, and even something like Apple News, which a lot of folks, especially, when I talk to my college students, how are they getting their news? This is one of the big ones, right? And I'm sure some of you might be as well, allowing you to completely personalize what news you see, when you see it, and even from, I want to see news from NBC, but I really want to see science news, or I don't want to see science news, or I really want to see political news, or I don't, right? So having an ability to really personalize and customize your news, which we've always been able to do to some extent, right? You could always just skip a story. It's not like you were forced to read a physical newspaper from cover to cover, but that ability to customize also kind of further limits your exposure, right? And gets you into a filter bubble. The other side of this is some of the challenges facing news organizations themselves, or journalism itself, right? As far as like what prevents us from being news literate. On some level, news is not a true, total, full reflection of reality or actual events, right? It's constructed by journalists and news organizations who are constrained and influenced by a variety of factors. There are economic, time, medium, and technological limitations. And this is if we're just giving everybody in journalism a complete benefit of the doubt, right? That a lot of news organizations don't have immense resources to cover things in the way that they would like to. The news cycle moves so quickly, and they're expected to, turn around stories so fast that compresses what they can cover and how they can cover it, right? If you're a smaller regional metro newspaper, like something like the PJ Star, right, you're going to have limitations based on the number of people you have on staff, the amount of stories or jobs that they're expected to do in a given day, the fact that you have a newspaper, but you increasingly have to pay attention to your website, and so like your attention to different mediums is split, right? So that creates limitations on what you get to cover and how you cover it. And then the technology piece, right? That if you're a smaller news organization, you might not have the newest and best technology to create the type of presentation of news that appeals to younger and tech savvy people. Or you might be a company that can do all of those things, but then it doesn't really reach people who aren't tech savvy, right? So different audiences are not being served particularly well at all corners of the age demographic, just as one example. This is all to say that, you know, it's this whole problem with news literacy or illiteracy, or as we'll talk about in the next session, like misinformation or disinformation. This is not just like a problem that is our fault, right? That we're spending too much time on our phones, that we're spending too much time on social media or watching cable news too much. There are issues with the news industry in America that have constrained their ability to do their job effectively, right? Beyond that piece, it's worth noting that when we're thinking about how our literacy is influenced and shaped, you know, things like agenda setting and framing are essential here, right? That by covering certain stories, news organizations tell us this is what's important, right? We talked about above the fold, right? Or whatever's on the front page of the website. And then by choosing to cover those things and put them on the front page, they're automatically choosing then not to cover all this other stuff, right? And situating that story or framing that story in a particular way, in theory, is to inform us, right? That the best case scenario is that we're framing this story in a way that is supposed to inform you, give you the most information, you can take action. But part of their job is to create a story that's also interesting or even entertaining to people. And so that changes how the story is situated, right? So news organizations that have all these limitations, financially, time, technologically, medium, format limitations, still have, you know, this ability to decide and determine what is important in a given community based on how it's covered or how it's not covered, right? And this still shapes our access to information, the things we know, how we know them in a given place and time, even if people are not paying attention to conventional news in the same way that they did 20, 30, 50 years ago, right? So this is a complicated issue, right? As far as how we determine what is news literacy, how we try to improve our news literacy, the obstacles that we face in being more news literate. There are a few conventional suggestions when we're thinking about, okay, you're looking at news, right? You're encountering a story, you're opening up a website, you're opening up your phone. Common things to look out for, right? And these are things that you've probably heard before. Is the story objective, right? Is the story accurate? Does the story feel complete? These are all tools that I think are useful, but have limitations. And this is not to say they're completely useless, but they have limitations if you're trying to be a little bit more news literate given the current environment that we're in. So objectivity is something that comes up all the time, but it's obviously a difficult standard to hold people to, and one to, you know, that's difficult to focus on so much because it's so like totalizing, right? You hear, you know, that stories need to be objective or they're not, right? Obviously, true objectivity is not really possible. And so everybody who's doing news has some form of perspective. The process is kind of supposed to help you get away from your perspective through talking to other people, doing your research, working with a team that can also help you, you know, workshop your work, edit your work, use the right word choices, you know, find other more interesting people to talk to, pushing you to be more curious and empathetic, right? All of those things lead to a process that could be more objective, but to suggest that like individual people can be totally objective is a little misguided. accuracy, obviously valuable, right? You want stories to be accurate. And we'll talk about, maybe how to seek out those things here in a second. But, the example that is always in like textbooks and conversations about media literacy, if a story has 19 accurate facts, but leaves out a 20th or 21st or 25th fact, does that mean it's inaccurate? Does that mean it's not a valuable story? So making sure things are true and factual, great, absolutely. But it's also maybe not the number one thing to explore. Same thing true there with, is the story complete? Is there a completeness to the story? Does it feel like all of the facts are there? Also useful, but, complete in whose mind, right? If the story has been framed in a certain way to be, a little bit more focused on the perspective of a powerful person in society, in the community, for instance, and it leaves out the voices of the people, the people who are not in power. Yeah, sure, maybe that's a complete story that kind of tells the basics of who, what, when, where, why, and how. But if it's framed towards one person or one institution a little bit more than a different group or a larger group of people, then, focusing on the idea of like, is it complete? Does it tell those basic facts? Is not really useful either. So a couple of things to look out for, and then we're going to get into some other suggestions and some examples here. I like to tell people to think about context, right? That journalists historically, even when I was in J school, there's always a little ickiness around context, not in that context is useless, but if you're adding too much context to your story, there can be concern in journalistic circles that you're kind of putting your thumb on the scale too much, right? That if you're contextualizing everything that's happening, you could be, getting away from just relaying accurate, complete facts. And, I think what's important is, especially in a world where you have all this information at your disposal on your phones, on your laptops, right? You have the ability, as we'll talk about, to seek out, context. So you should expect your news organizations to provide it, right? If you can find out all this additional information, why wouldn't you want fact-checked news to include a lot of that information, right? So if there are, particular, let's say there's, crimes happening in a given community, if you only report those things as isolated incidents and you don't talk about contextual factors that might lead people to commit crime, whether that's, poverty, healthcare issues, the lack of like mental health and counseling support, those sort of things that there's tons of research that shows, that leads people to make some of these decisions that might lead to criminal activity. You create a sense over time that these crimes are maybe, just happening because of the fault of those individual people. And you create a certain perception about your community without including some of the broader context or the responsibility of the institutions in society, whether that's the government, whether that's healthcare system, whatever that is, right, to provide the support to those people. So I think more and more you should be looking for news sources to provide some, not all. Obviously, every story can't be 10,000 words, but adding context, even if that's just linking to previous related stories, underlining ways in which things have more social or historical significance in a given community, in the whole country, the whole world, whatever that may be, because there's all this other information that you can find out there, so that it should be framed with context in mind, not just like this one thing happened. I think balance is also important, but not in the conventional way. I think more often than not, people focus on balance as a sort of both sides, that we're going to provide different perspectives on an issue. Group A says this, Group B says that. The conventional version is like, Democrats say this, Republicans say that. Rarely are there just two sides to any story, right? There's a lot of different perspectives, even in that example, among people in a political party, right? But what I mean by balance is really like making more choices about how we weigh who gets to talk and whose perspective and whose information appears in the story. Meaning, if it's a story about climate change, for instance, a very bad balanced version of that story is we bring in climate scientists who talk about all the real tangible examples and evidence as to why we're in a pretty tricky spot as far as climate goes. And then you bring on multiple voices who represent oil and gas companies or who represent various nefarious institutions that contribute heavily to greenhouse gases, pollution, things like that, right? And you sort of let them speak equally. That's a very conventional version of balance, right? We're giving both sides a platform. I think more and more journalists are reckoning with the idea that in certain cases, you have to weigh those differently, right? If we're talking about like cataclysmic planetary like survival, we need to not give the representatives of Exxon or whomever the same amount of space that we give scientists, right? And we've seen a lot of kind of reckoning with that as far as information related to the pandemic as well. When there's skepticism about things like the vaccine or even the existence of the pandemic, right? So thinking about balance not as just like a 50-50 equation and more of balancing, literal truth, even if there are people who don't believe that truth, right? Making sure that you're focusing on things that are agreed upon facts by experts. One that isn't always mentioned, but I always try to add in these conversations is transparency. So if you are a heavy news consumer, and I bet a lot of the folks here are, a lot of people who come to these sessions are folks who are really interested in the topic, heavy news consumers. So they're engaged with news more than the general public. One way to really identify how a news organization is doing is are they clear when they mess things up, right? Are they clear not only when people call them out for getting a small thing wrong, but do they reflect on, as individual journalists or whole institutions or TV networks, how they maybe covered a story without context or without balance, right? Are they talking more explicitly about why they, as a company or a journalist, think a story matters, right? And these, again, are typically pieces of writing or presentation or packaging that journalists have tried to avoid because it sort of suggests a certain level of bias or perspective, right? You shouldn't tell your audience a story's perspective or is important. You should show it to them. But if we have all these issues with news literacy and information literacy, and there's all this skepticism about what's true and what's false, I do think that there's a little bit of a sea change with journalists being a lot more explicit as far as talking to their audience and sources and framing of their stories. Like, this is an important issue, right? We can't avoid it, and we have to talk about it in this way. And we need to bring in, the voices of people who are not maybe represented very often in the media, right? In news. And so are people being more transparent, not only about how they got there, how they did their work, who they talked to, but why they did it. And, if they mess things up or they take things out of context, are they apologizing for that? Are they issuing corrections? Those are things that have been done historically, but I think that this cycle moves so quickly online that it's easy to just kind of let people forget them. So are they being transparent? Those are some big picture suggestions. But when you're thinking about how do you do this on a regular basis, exposure and scope are really important, I think, to new sources, to new ideas, to new perspectives. I struggle with this just as much as anybody in the audience, I'm sure. As I said, it's really easy, especially in this environment. There's so many options to just pick the few that you really like, that you think are credible, that appeal to you, and just keep going back to them. Like, that reliability and trust factor does matter, but it's also important to kind of go outside of that bubble, right? And to think about, what is the scope of my news consumption, right? Do I have kind of really narrow band where I'm only looking at a few things regularly? Or am I occasionally even expanding outward, once a month, looking at a few different sources? or looking at news or consuming news on a different platform. I'm a heavy TV viewer, so I watch cable TV every night. Maybe I'm going to do a little bit more exploration, in podcasts or online, or the reversal, right? I'm only reading news on my phone on Apple News, so I'm going to try to watch more things on TV. And maybe you hate it, maybe you don't like it, maybe it doesn't appeal to you, but you're at least seeing kind of what is going on out there, even if it's not something that really appeals to you. And also thinking about the scope of the sources themselves, right? Is their coverage area narrow and narrow and narrow, right? Are they focusing so much on a few issues over a longer period of time? And what does that tell you? I think just from my vantage point, one of the biggest challenges that like local TV faces is that, even though the local television is doing better than local newspapers, for instance, they're still not flush with cash and resources to really cover things in detail. So you end up with a lot of stories that are totally crime oriented, right? I watch the local TV news in Peoria every morning. And I usually flip around between a few channels to just kind of see what people are covering. And it's limited because a couple of the stations are owned by the same corporation. But oftentimes, it's just story after story that's crime, something involving, the police. And obviously those things are happening, but it paints a really dire picture of the community, right? In Central Illinois in general, when that's not the only stuff that's going on, right? But one byproduct of that, or reason for that, is, it's really easy to get that information from the police department, right? They have public information folks, and that's no disrespect to those folks who are doing their job, right? But increasingly police departments putting that information available, even on social media, on Facebook, putting out full press releases. And they, absolutely, they go for things that are easy, and not like, oh, this is easy because I don't want to do my job, but it's like, we need another story and we don't have the time, right? You go back to those time limitations, those economic limitations. So even if you are the journalist and you're like, man, I see these three things that are happening and we should really do a tight 4-minute investigation on this thing, but I don't totally have the time. And that doesn't fit into our like 30-second bits of news that we do in the morning, television. And this is not just a Peoria problem, right? Like when I watch the local news in Indianapolis, when I'm at home, it's the same sort of deal, right? And that's just a matter of, not having the resources, not having the time. So even the source has like a narrow scope of news. When we're thinking about your particular habits here, I know, and we're getting shorter on time, this little table I created, I've taken this from a literacy textbook that I like to use, but obviously we've got 4 categories here. And in theory, this is supposed to add up to 100. So I'm curious if anybody would be willing to share, individual percentages between international events, national, regional, and local. How much is each of these categories, or how much time are you spending in each of these categories? So are you spending, 50, 20, 20, 10? Is it, 0, 50, 10, 40? What are we doing here? Does anybody want to share? I'll give you a moment to think about this. Where are you consuming news or looking for information about? I feel like for the record, mine is probably maybe 10% international, and probably then 40 or 50% national, which is just the result of how news is delivered to some extent, right? So much of it is nationally focused. So then that leaves, only 40 or 50% for regional and local, right? And a lot of the advice in these books, and if you go to the various great websites that talk about news literacy, always talk about expanding your horizons, thinking more, internationally, right? But generally people want like local news the most, right? Like Bob's answer in the comments in the chat, people want local news the most because it impacts them the most. But then local news is sort of the realm where there are those most economic, time, technological challenges. And so you end up not getting the best type of news and information, right? You end up getting those crime oriented stories or the really easy stories that provide like an engine to do a lot of easy reporting. And again, that's no disrespect to any journalist. It's a hard job. You know, you have to kind of do what you got to do in a given day to get the job done. But you know, there's a push to get people to do more expansion of news, because that gives you different perspectives, right? That especially, you know, stepping outside kind of the big American mainstream media bubble, if you will. And that's something that I've tried to do a little bit more this year, but I fail at it. You know, we only have so much time in the day. But I think the challenge is so many people want local news the most. And then the local news sources are maybe not as great as they once were or could be because of all of these other limitations, which affects our interest and then potentially affects our, you know, our literacy. Just a couple other things here, and I appreciate the feedback in the chat. Couple pieces of advice that I always give to improve news literacy. And obviously we could talk about this for 10 hours. You know, the power of reading laterally instead of vertically. This is such a great way to think about being more news and media literate, using the tools of the internet and your phone and all these screens to your advantage to understanding stories and news better. Now, one of the challenges with that is something we talked about in the first session, and just that like you can easily fall down one rabbit hole after another. But it is so easy to click links in the story. It's so easy to search for certain headlines or terms or people who are in the news, you know, in a search bar, in a search engine. You know, get outside of that tab or whatever on your phone or on your computer and look at the story elsewhere, right? And thinking about how is it being covered in different places, even using heavily moderated global tools, excuse me, like Wikipedia, which is an amazing source to get context and history. Excuse me. And I think part of this just comes from, you know, even speaking as someone who learned a lot about media literacy in school, and, you know, had to take a lot of classes related to it. There was so much conversation when I was really young, you know, in like 90s and early 2000s about the URL, right? Like the .com versus .org versus .net. Those things absolutely do matter. There was also a sense of like, how does the website look? And does that add credibility? Which it certainly does. But it's so much easier now to deliver completely uncredible, completely untrue, or, you know, half true, half credible information on a great looking website with a professional URL, right? It might not be like a .org, but a really nice sounding website name. All of those things that, you know, 20 years ago or 25 years ago was like, well, this is very clearly not great information just based on how it's presented to you, right? So, you know, thinking more about how I'm encountering information and I could just let it wash over me. But if I really want to know and I want to be informed, I can look at this at another news source. Or, you know, if I see something on TV, maybe we don't want to have our phones or our computers on our lap while we're watching TV. But if you really want to know something and think about it a little bit more deeply, use the tools at your disposal to actually figure this stuff out. And that's one that has been, you know, really helpful for me when I think about some of the big complicated subjects, you know, things related to the pandemic. You know, one right now, like the tension between, you know, Ukraine and Russia, which is such a complicated, long-standing issue with a lot of different factors involved, and other countries get involved, NATO involved, right? That's really complicated. And when you see it on TV or on social media, it gets distilled to this very simplistic thing. So being able to read 5 different articles from 5 different publications, that helps me. Now, that again gets you in a place where maybe you're consuming too much about a particular topic, but, you know, you have to kind of build those muscles to then know how to use them and know when to back off, right? So using the tools that are at your disposal, right? Using the full capability of your phone or your computer to really underline what you can do. The News Literacy Project, to kind of put a button on this, I know we started a couple minutes late, but adds a lot of examples here of questions to ask when you're reading laterally. Who funds this website, right? So if you want to really dig into like what you're seeing, are there initial results from like fact-checking organizations, even something like Snopes, right, or PolitiFact? Are other articles writing about it in the same way or raising the same questions? Is there credible or contradictory information that you're finding in other sites or other posts? Are the most credible news organizations you trust writing about it? These are all great questions to ask. And it's also worth, kind of thinking just in general, as we conclude here, about agenda setting and framing once again, right? Like, if every news organization is writing about something, that's probably telling you that it's important. When we say, I think people get scared of the word agenda, that the news or the media has an agenda. But, right before our session, I went to LA Times, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, like 5 different websites, and all of them at the top or right below the top story had a big thing about the market, right? So we know from just thinking about agenda setting, these are the things that matter. But then that allows you to start thinking more critically about, like, why are these things prioritized above other things, right? Like, why do we spend so much time talking about stocks, right? As opposed to, issues that might affect more people differently, right? Whether that's, again, something like healthcare or whatever. And that maybe starts to tell you a little bit about who they think their audience is, who they, what they think their audience wants, the questions that they want their audience to be thinking about. So, reading laterally, slowing down, but also really focusing on agenda setting and framing, and not in a negative way, right? Like, stories have to be framed. And news does set the agenda, and we just have to be better consumers of that. So we'll talk more about this in our next session and beyond. Our next session will be Thursday, March 3rd at 6 p.m. North Branch, and also simulcast on Zoom. Hopefully we won't have any major weather episodes that time. To answer Bob's question in the chat, the first one we just did in person, and then we realized we can kind of do both here moving forward. So next time we're going to talk more about spotting misinformation and disinformation, especially on places like social media, and how you can kind of deal with that. And in the future, we'll talk about a lot of other things related to social media and media habits outside of the context of news. So thank you so much. And yes, I will absolutely share my PowerPoint from January as well. I can send that to you, Alice. And this will be up on YouTube, and we'll be back next month, first Thursday of every month for the rest of the year. Thanks, folks. I can hang around and answer any questions if you have them.
Thanks, Dr. Cory. Good job. Bye-bye.
Thank you.